In the late 2000s, Shirley Pierce starts dating her co-worker Chuck Reeves. 4 years later, the couple are engaged to be married. However, the pair would never make it down the aisle. Tragedy rocks the nearly married couple as Chuck comes home to a brutal scene.
And he discovered a horrible crime scene inside the house.
There was a mess in the bedroom and into the bathroom.
There were stains on the carpet. There was a bloody footprint.
Following the blood trails, Chuck discovers his fiancée lying dead in the bathtub.
They described it as multiple stab wounds to the victim and therefore a very bloody scene.
It was really difficult for the community to comprehend the extent of this, especially where it happened. This area is not known for that type of behavior, but evil doesn't choose neighborhoods. Evil can happen in the city, evil can happen in the community, and this was a very evil offense.
There was a blade of a knife that was still stuck in her neck.
This is a knife that was plunged so strongly into somebody's neck that it broke. I can't understand how someone is that filled with rage and filled with jealousy.
This was unlike anything I've ever seen. She was absolutely the most jealous human being that I've ever witnessed.
Investigators are now on the case, working hard to enact justice on an envious, green-eyed killer. July 23, 2013. Textile salesman Chuck Reeves is trying to call his fiancée Shirley Pierce, but receives no answer. Growing concerned, he decides to drive straight to Shirley's house.
Chuck Reeves, her fiancé, went to the house and he got there and he noticed that the garage door was up, the door was locked, there was a hidden key in the garage. He took the key and went inside the house.
He heard water running when he walked in the front door.
There was a mess in the bedroom and into the bathroom.
There were stains on the carpet. There was a bloody footprint. The stains, they believed, were blood. They were throughout the house.
Following the trail of bloodstains and the sound of running water, Chuck makes his way to the bathroom and makes a shocking discovery. It is here he finds the lifeless body of his fiancée, Shirley, covered in blood.
Chuck called 911, and the dispatcher asked him if he believed she was beyond help, and he replied yes. The dispatcher asked if he could tell whether Shirley had been shot or stabbed, and his reply was that he couldn't go back in there.
I got the feeling he was still in shock from finding his girlfriend dead in a bathtub and a lot of blood involved, a lot of violence. So it's something Chuck's not used to seeing.
Rowan County has about 165,000 people. It's the 18th biggest county in North Carolina. But we have a lot of rural area as much as we do cities and municipalities.
From my experience, Kannapolis is not an area that has a lot of violent crime. There are communities around Kannapolis that have much more violent crime. It has been very rare to cover homicides or other types of violent crimes. It just doesn't happen that often there.
Not in particularly a high crime area, no. In 28 years of law enforcement, you can count on one or two hands these type of scenes, especially in rural North Carolina. In an area not really known for violent crime, these are very few and far between.
Shirley was just an outgoing lady. She would give anyone the shirt off of her back. She had sisters and a brother that she was very close to.
A lot of the people who knew Shirley couldn't believe anybody would want to kill her.
Everybody was just in shock.
This was a very sweet, loyal, hard-working person. When she wasn't working, she was doing charitable work. She was a very good friend and an overall just wonderful human being.
People were stunned and surprised that a homicide took place in this house, in this neighborhood, at this time of the day, and that a man would go in and discover this brutal and bloody crime scene, and now the work of the detectives had begun.
The very first people to respond to a scene like that is your patrol units. The patrol officer had a very minimal task other than securing the scene, ensure that there were no more victims in the house, no more people to render aid to, and then the patrol officer would simply lock down the scene until the crime scene and the detectives would have responded. The people allowed into the scene during this time is kept at a very minimal, because you want to make sure that the crime scene is not hindered in any way. You have DNA now that we collect, so it is very important first to document the scene with both video and photographs first before anything is disturbed, because you never ever get a chance to go back and see that crime scene again for the first time. So you want that crime scene as pristine and as original as you can to capture that on your video and on your photographs.
The officers went into the residence, and the caller, Mr. Reeves, advised them that she was in the bathtub in the bedroom area, and so the officers went to that location to verify that she was deceased.
I seen stab marks on numerous locations on her body. She had a lot of blunt force trauma to her arms and her face.
She had wounds on her hands that appeared she was fighting off the attack.
And then a large stab wound into her neck, which I felt was probably the fatal wound.
They described it as multiple stab wounds to the victim, and therefore a very bloody scene.
The coroner felt that she had bled out from her injuries, loss of blood, and that matches what the crime scene looked like. When your heart beats, blood continues to flow through your wounds, and until you run out of blood, you stay alive. So it's not really known exactly how long she lived after the assault, but she did not die a quick death. She may have been unconscious, but her body and her heart was beating enough to basically pump most of her blood out of her body and her system.
Anyone that would have known the victim, spoke to the victim recently, visited the victim recently, would have, of course, been a person of interest. We interview all those individuals, and we try to make sure we rule out anybody that should not be a person of interest.
It's an automatic response on the part of law enforcement to look at those special people in the lives of victims, and Chuck Reeves certainly would have been the top of the list. Being that he's the one who discovered her, he's the one who called 911, it certainly would not have been unusual for law enforcement to initially want to not suspect him necessarily, but at least look into his background and understand his history with Shirley Pierce.
So I asked Chuck to sit in the front seat of my car with me in front of the residence, and he and I spoke. And I was very suspicious of Chuck Reeves.
The work that they did with Chuck to determine whether or not to rule him out, they had to find out his alibi. They found out that he had a solid alibi. He had been in touch with Shirley the night before. They had made plans to be together that day, the day of the homicide, the day that he went over there. And then physically, when they looked at him, he was fine. He didn't have scratches. They didn't find blood. They didn't find any evidence on his body, on his hands, or anywhere else that would lead them to believe that he would have been involved in a very brutal, very bloody murder.
I was monitoring his demeanor and the way he said things, kind of hinging on every word, because sometimes they try to be deliberate, but if you listen carefully enough, they will give something away. And I wasn't getting that from Chuck Reeves. I started leaning towards he was really mourning, grieving person by the time we finished.
Following the interrogation of Chuck Reeves, suspicions surrounding his involvement in the murder of Shirley start to wane. However, when detectives conduct a thorough forensic review of the crime scene, a new suspect is about to be identified. July 2013. Following Chuck Reeves' discovery that his fiancée, Shirley Pierce, has been stabbed multiple times and left dead in her bathtub, investigators are at the crime scene trying to find out who is responsible for this shocking murder.
On several factors, it became clear to me that the attack happened in the bedroom. From the blood stain on the carpet next to the bed, felt like it happened in her bedroom next to the bathroom where we found her body at. So she was killed there and then dumped in the bathtub.
It's almost like a puzzle you're trying to put together. Why are they in the bathtub? Why is this many injuries? And generally when you see a knife attack is very personal. It's not very stranger oriented. A knife attack to this extent and this violent generally means that I have a problem with you. I have a dislike for you. I want to do you harm. Sometimes assuming is not the right thing to do, but you're already assuming that I knew this person, I was upset at this person, I had enough animosity and anger in my body to do this type of damage to a person, because a knife attack is personal, especially to this extent. So you automatically are starting to say this is not a crime done by a stranger that has no animosity. This is done by somebody that is angry, and they have a reason to be angry with the victim.
After speaking to family and friends, we found out Shirley's sleep habits. She goes in her bedroom when it's time for bed, puts her nightshirt on. She also takes her jewelry off. We found her body. She still had her jewelry on, so it made me feel like she was getting attacked while she was in the process of getting ready for bed.
You know right away as a detective and investigator when you see that scene that it was a violent attack. When you see that many knife wounds and you learn that it was done at night, in the evening when she's coming in, she's in her bedroom, she's changing her clothes after a day of being out or doing work or wherever she was, and you can only imagine the surprise and horror of an attack like that, and you don't know the conversation before. You know, was it an ambush? Was she cornered in the bedroom? You don't know what led up in that bedroom to that attack. Was it a surprise attack? Was it after dialogue? Those questions you'll never know because you weren't there. And of course, the suspect is not going to tell you that. But those are the things that go through investigators' minds of what happened right before the first knife wound happened. Was there a conversation? Was it a sneak attack? You know, those type of things we'll never know.
Anytime you have to notify a family of a death like that, it's very difficult. There's really no good way to do it. We try our best not to ever do that over the phone. We always try to make those in-person visits. We did make contact with her daughter, and we did inform her of the death, and she did take it very hard.
Word of Shirley's death spreads quickly through the community. It's not long before Shirley's co-worker Irvin Johnson hears the news of her murder. He contacts the police with a tip to investigate his very own wife, Marlene Johnson.
It wasn't long before they had gotten the phone call from Irvin Johnson saying that his wife had a problem with Shirley Pierce. Irvin Johnson was CFO for Tuscarora Yarns, which is a textile plant. Shirley was his administrative assistant. As soon as he got word that something had happened, he took the responsibility of contacting law enforcement to say, I might have a clue for you.
Irvin contacted us to let us know that his wife was obsessed with Shirley Pierce, but she was convinced that they had had an affair, and he said they absolutely did not have an affair, but Marlene was convinced they did.
He denied it. He said that never was. He said, my wife doesn't believe it. She's thought this for years, but we have never had a relationship outside of work.
And that could have been something that contributed to Shirley Pierce's death. He told law enforcement that their relationship had been very rough, and he said particularly over the last 10 years, that Marlene had grown more paranoid in the belief that he was having an affair with Shirley, and that she kept acting on that belief. At one point, he had taken out a restraining order against Marlene Johnson to keep her away from him. She had assaulted him in the past. Their relationship was obviously very strained, and he was aware that his ex-wife posed a great threat to Shirley Pierce.
If you believe this person has killed someone else, you want to be very careful yourself of what information you provide and how you provide it to protect you. So investigators with his information have to keep that very close to themselves. They can't let the suspect know, well, your husband said that he feels you may have done that, because if she gets out and goes kills him, you've lost the witness. And also witnesses are very hesitant to come forward when they feel that their safety may be in danger. So he had a lot to lose if she wasn't the murderer. He would damage what relationship there was, and he had a safety issue that if she was the murderer, he has to be very careful for his safety as well, especially in an attack like this. If you're willing to kill someone with a knife, you're just as willing to kill a witness, I would believe.
While I was talking to Chuck, is when we got the call from Irvin Johnson and saying that he wanted to meet with us because he thought his wife had killed somebody. And when I mentioned that name to Chuck, he was very familiar with that lady. And he started giving me a little bit of a background on it from his perspective. He had told about an incident in a restaurant where Shirley and, well, most of the folks, the admin, the office staff, would routinely go to lunch.
And so one day they were all there, and Shirley Pierce was there, and they noticed that Marlene was in the restaurant as well, and she was trying to hide her face behind a menu as she sat several tables over. But the folks from Tuscarora Yarns recognized that that's who that was, and they knew that Marlene had this problem with Shirley. So once they finished and they got up to leave, the other employees put Shirley in the middle of a circle, and they formed this cordon around her to walk through the parking lot. As they were leaving, Marlene also chose to leave at that moment, and she began screaming at Shirley and the other workers in the parking lot. And she charged towards them, and she was able to break through the line that the other employees had formed in front of Shirley, and she got to Shirley
and pushed her on the ground and started kicking and assaulting her. And Shirley was in the hospital for several days from that incident. I begged her to press charges, but I don't think Shirley ever believed that Marlene would go that far. She said the company was going to press a restraining order, and so she didn't feel she needed to press any charges.
Chuck Reeves, he told me that Shirley had an issue with this lady and that he knew she had a restraining order against her, and that she had had a long history of this lady just stalking her, but that Shirley had downplayed it and thought everything was going to be okay.
Detectives are concerned about Marlene Johnson's stalking of Shirley Pierce, and now consider Johnson to be a prime suspect in Shirley's murder. Their investigation has a new focus.
The initial stages of any investigation is information gathering. How much information can we get in the first 24 hours? That's talking to family, people at work, anybody of interest that would know the victim. A neighborhood canvass was done to where every neighbor was spoken to. Doors were knocked on all throughout the community. It's an information gathering session. Investigators found that no matter who they talked to, they had said Marlene seemed to have a very paranoid disposition, especially things in her love life with her husband and with the victim and the relationships at work.
So Irvin told me right after he came to work there that Marlene had always picked out the single women at a company and targeted them for having an affair with him. And so Shirley was one of the single women at the company, and so she got targeted. And Marlene had in her head that Shirley had had an affair with her husband, Irvin Johnson. She keyed the side of Shirley's company vehicle. She left dead flowers on the front porch of Shirley's home. She would call Shirley's house and give threats. And she even came into the building with Irvin's company key, and she had left all kind of messages and notes in Shirley's office.
But it's not long after the investigation has begun that a local police officer comes into contact with suspect Marlene Johnson, and the case takes a turn.
Marlene is driving in Huntersville in daylight that morning, and there was a marked police vehicle behind her. And they came to a stoplight, and Marlene, being paranoid, like anybody would if they had just committed a murder, assumed the police were on to her. They were, pulling her over for this murder. The officer was not. He was just on the way, driving down the road on a routine. He wasn't planning on pulling over her or anybody else, and they came to stop. Marlene gets out of her car and walks back to the police officer and asked him why he's following her, and was he following her because she was a suspect in a murder that occurred. and the officer obviously did not have a clue what she was talking about, but he did run her license plate number, verify who she was, and thanks to him, he did send out a message to local law enforcement in the area, which included our agency in Rowan County, that she had mentioned the statement about was she being pulled over or stopped, or was he following her because she was a suspect in a murder. He sent out a message saying, does anybody have a murder that just occurred because I had this strange situation.
This was very crucial that he was able to document her actually confessing to information that unless you're the murderer, you don't know. Because we have not released any of who our suspects were. We didn't tell her that she was a suspect or others were.
And so when we spoke to that officer over the phone, that's when he was able to tell us, and it did look like she had some injuries to her hands or arms.
Anytime we have an assaultive incident like that, the assailant tends to injure themselves either through defensive wounds or if they use a knife. In order to strike somebody with a knife hard enough, generally it will cut them as well.
And also him noticing not only what she's saying, but the cuts on her hand, and him having the intelligence to report that beyond just the patrol level was a very big part of this case.
The eerie thing was that she was so paranoid about this that she had to go up to the police because she thought she was being pulled over for the murder. So we took all those things in consideration when developing her as a suspect. Obviously, when you're already a suspect because there was a restraining order against you that had just expired, that puts you on the list of being a heightened suspect. Now you have this other incident where you're saying this to a random police officer, so now that even heightens the severity there of you being a more credible suspect. She mentioned to the officer that she was on the way to her attorney's office and mentioned his name, James Davis, who's a well-known attorney in Salisbury, North Carolina, which is right across the street from our office.
After receiving intel on this highly questionable encounter, detectives decide to move in on a formal search of suspect Marlene Johnson's home. The murder investigation is about to intensify. July 2013. Following the horrific murder of 62-year-old secretary Shirley Pierce, detectives are starting to focus their investigation around a prime suspect, 61-year-old Marlene Johnson. The police have now obtained a search warrant for Marlene Johnson's home and make their move.
She lived in a very nice neighborhood in Davidson, Mooresville area.
In her home, and we found lots of things that were just unsettling for someone to be focused on. Pieces of mail that was addressed to Shirley at her address. We found aerial maps with Shirley's address laying out on the table.
There were photos of the house, even aerial photos of Shirley's house. It's almost like something we would do in an investigative file if we're investigating somebody for drug dealing. We're going to go by and get pictures of the house, aerials of the house, look at some utility bills.
Marlene was extremely jealous of Shirley Pierce because Marlene believed that Shirley was having an affair with her husband.
What you see here is she's building a case to prove that Shirley and Irvin were having this affair, which we still know is not true, but it was her belief.
Law enforcement said repeatedly they never found one bit of evidence to indicate that anything like that ever happened, that there was no affair, there simply wasn't. And yet Marlene acted on this to the point of tracking Shirley's movements, doing research on her house, knowing the rooms in the house, knowing the coming and going of Shirley Pierce. I mean, she was taking extreme steps that were all born out of this jealousy, this belief that Shirley Pierce was having an affair with her husband. Marlene hired a private investigator in order to track Shirley Pierce's movements.
I'm actually surprised by that because she thought she was the private investigator. She thought she was the one in control of that. She was trying to get outside validation to confirm what she believed to be true.
She wanted to see if, in fact, there was any physical evidence. She wanted to see if the private investigator could put Shirley Pierce with Irvin Johnson in some way that would give credence to her thought that they were having an affair, and that never happened.
It really points to her obsession and almost a paranoia about the victim, that she was just consumed with tracking this person and finding out what this person was doing. It became something that consumed her.
At Shirley's house, forensic investigators start to gather evidence and DNA samples from the crime scene.
And we were very fortunate this is an inside environment. You're not worried about the weather, you're not worried about rain, so you can really take your time, slow down, and do a good detailed investigation. We're taking blood samples from every location in the house. There were some tracks that looked like they'd been tried to be cleaned up with bleach. There were other bloody footprints that weren't. Crime scene guys would be taking samples of each of those blood areas. Wherever we are locating blood, we can tell whose blood that is. It's not uncommon at all for attacks with knives to leave marks and injuries to the suspect as well, because they get cuts on their hands and they will also bleed. And of course, we know DNA from those wounds would be very substantial to a case like this.
The evidence they collected included what turned out to be the murder weapon, a broken knife. They collected a lot of other things. They collected clothes, carpet samples, hair samples. There was evidence that they could find on Shirley's body, samples, things where they would get DNA on Shirley's hands, Shirley's fingernails.
DNA-related items collected. A shower curtain was one. It had blood on it in different areas, so we collected the whole entire shower curtain. There were some paper towels that looked like they were used to clean up the area by the suspect, so we collected those.
We eventually sent those things off to be tested. And there was also, Shirley Pierce DNA, of course, but Marlene Johnson DNA was overwhelming.
The DNA of Marlene Johnson is found on both the shower curtain and the paper towels at the crime scene. Investigators grow confident that Johnson is the killer. As their search of Marlene Johnson's home continues, detectives receive a call that will progress the case even further.
I was conducting a search warrant. That's when we were finding all the things, the aerial map of Shirley's home, the mail in her house. And so all that was going on when I learned that Lieutenant Owens had arrested Marlene Johnson at her attorney's office.
She went to his office, apparently knowing that things were going to get a little dicey, and she wanted to make sure she had her ducks in a row with legal representation. The law enforcement found out that she was there and wanted to go ahead and get her into custody. Law enforcement says she's in there doing an interview with her lawyer, and she's wearing dark sunglasses and strange look.
We set up on the attorney's office and did surveillance for quite a while, so several hours she was there before coming outside. As soon as we began to approach her in the parking lot and we identified ourselves as being sheriff's office, she took off running back towards the entrance of the attorney's office, and we had to chase her down in the parking lot. We then allowed her to go inside the attorney's office, and we informed her attorney that we were arresting her for the murder of Shirley. She didn't say anything. She didn't act surprised. She made no statements whatsoever.
I sat her in the interview room, and then I noticed fresh cuts on her hands. She also had like a French manicure, nails. She was proud of her appearance and always tried to look, nice. Her fingernails were broke off, the French manicure. She had some that were still there and some of them were gone. Reminded me of like a female getting in a fight with someone and losing fingernails. And while I'm doing all this and having her move her hands around so I can photograph the injury, she had on a pair of sunglasses. She kind of laid her head on the wall and fell asleep several times. If I'm in a detective's office and they're photographing injuries on my hand, I'm being investigated for a homicide, I'm probably not going to be sleepy. I'm going to be wide awake and scared. But she'd been up all night and she was just tired from her deeds.
Initially, we charged her with murder, and then later the next day, I went and amended the warrants and charged her with a first-degree burglary as well.
There were those who fully expected that she was going to be the one charged with this homicide. So they were relieved to know that, they were correct in their assumptions, and they were relieved to know that Marlene was off the streets. Then from the folks who didn't know this situation, they were just relieved to know that the suspect in this horrible murder was now behind bars, that they could at least feel safe, and that they would know that, no, this was not a random attack. This wasn't some random crime where someone was just targeted for no reason. Now they knew, yeah, there was something going on here. There was a relationship there. And so I would say it was relief more than anything else that she was in jail. It was one of the most shocking crimes of that year, of that period, because again, this is not the neighborhood where things like that happen. It's not the city where that sort of thing happens very often. And then just the fact that it was such a heinous, horrible crime, the way that it was carried out, it was the talk of the town for quite some time. In fact, I would say that it was a big topic of conversation right up through the trial, because people followed the developments along the way. It caught the interest of folks, but they were very stunned, very shocked by it. And I guess the one thing that was sort of comforting was the fact that law enforcement made the arrest within a few hours. So you didn't have the specter of this killer out there loose. You know, most folks said, well, they got her, and, you know, that's that.
And then it doesn't end there. Once we get them in custody, we've got to continue to work and make that case to where it's going to survive any challenges in the court system. And so that gave us lots of time to work on that by getting her in there so quickly. But I am so proud of our team, and the teamwork that they exude made all that possible.
Now behind bars, Marlene Johnson awaits her trial. January 2018. It's been 5 years since the murder of 62-year-old Secretary Shirley Pierce. The day of the trial has finally arrived, and the accused, 66-year-old Marlene Johnson, faces a wealth of evidence against her in the case.
Well, the collection of evidence is very critical. One of the things that came out was that Marlene Johnson sent a text to what she thought was Shirley Pierce's phone, and it basically said to back off, stay away from my husband. You're only going to get my husband over my dead body. And she sent that text, and she thought that would be something Shirley Pierce would be reading, but she made a mistake in the number, and it ended up going to a 15-year-old. And the 15-year-old's reply was, who is this? And Marlene at that point realized that at least all the homework that she had done, here she did something wrong. She either had a wrong number or entered a wrong number and sent that text to somebody else, not the intended recipient.
Her text message to the wrong person was really a piece of evidence that was very damning to her. She sends this message where she thinks she sent it to the victim, but she's sending it to a 15-year-old child. That was a very dumb thing. And even if it was to the right person, of course, we in law enforcement are going to pull those phone records. We're going to see that text message to the victim from you, and in a threatening manner.
It's one thing to have a circumstantial case, but it's another thing to have that evidence, those things that were there at that time, those things that were used in the commission of a crime. You have to have that. And those things made for very powerful testimony once the trial came up. So those things are extremely important.
When faced with the murder charges, Marlene Johnson states that she was not present in Shirley's home when the killing took place, instead claiming to have been with her partner Tim at the time.
Tim was Marlene's male friend she was talking to. Marlene had said she was at his house the night of the murder and couldn't have done it. When she named him as an alibi, he had said that yes, she was with him.
He was lying for her, obviously, in the beginning when we first talked to him about were they together and what they were doing.
I've interrogated a lot of people over the years, and the one thing you look for is any inconsistency. The truth doesn't need help. Right, you're going to tell the truth, and it doesn't need to be justified or fortified with anything else. And there were several times in that story where he had to fortify the truth. Some inconsistencies in his body language as the questions became more and more about him and his involvement and what he did as being possibly an accomplice to this.
Once he realized that this was a murder investigation, that's when he decided to tell the truth and change his story.
I just told him, I said, hey, look, we're going to continue to investigate this. I believe Marlene Johnson committed this crime and that you know information that you're withholding from me. And if that's the case, Tim, I'm going to seek charges on you for your involvement. He leaned back in his chair. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked back down at me. He said, I haven't been exactly honest with you fellas. And I said, I know, Tim, let's fix it right now, right? And so then his story started to change to where she was not with him that entire night. And he couldn't account for her from the time he laid down until the next morning when she showed back up at his house.
Marlene must have watched a few too many detective shows and felt like maybe she had some ideas of how to cover up a crime scene. She tried to use bleach to cover blood, which is ineffective, but she didn't know that. She tried to herself have an alibi of being in another city, in another county at the time that this happened. So she did put some thought into it. Wasn't good thought, but she did put thought into it to try to cover her tracks and even miss some of those.
The DNA evidence inside Shirley's home where Marlene claimed to have never been. If you've never been there, there's no way your DNA is there. And people argue in legal circles that there's transferred DNA and stuff like that goes on, but there was no evidence of any of that.
While questioning Tim in his home, the investigators noticed something suspicious in his kitchen.
It was actually like a block, like a knife block where you store these knives. One of the knives was missing, which seemed out of place for him. I asked him to draw it. I said, what's that knife look like? And actually I had him draw out the shape, the outline of the knife, what the blade would look like.
And that appeared to be similar to the knife used that we found located in the victim.
He couldn't tell us what happened to it, didn't say he'd lost it, some time ago. He just told us he did not know where that knife was at.
She retrieved the murder weapon from his home.
Throughout the trial, Marlene Johnson acted like she was here by mistake. She was like a student who wanders into the wrong classroom. She didn't seem to understand that her life was hanging in the balance here. And so once the case was being presented and she would hear things that were very damning against her, she would shake her head. She would get in her lawyer's ear. She would write notes on these legal pads and just pass that over to the lawyers, and they would give it a cursory look and then pass it right back. She was paying attention to what was going on, but it was just this look of, I shouldn't be here. I mean, I've covered a lot of murder trials, and I've never seen anybody act the way she did. Shirley's daughter was in the courtroom. There were other family members there as well. The members of her family had badges that they made that had Shirley's face on it, and they wore those badges in court and talked about why they thought that was important. They told me they wanted Shirley's face to be remembered. They wanted her face to be seen in the courtroom. They wanted the jury to see that this family cared greatly about this woman, and that if they looked over there, they would see Shirley Pierce's face on these badges.
DNA puts you there, fingerprints put you there. With her blood being on items and towels that were used to clean up, her blood being in the house with the victim, there's no way to explain out of that. That is a guilty verdict right there in almost every court in the United States. When your DNA and your blood is in the residence with the victim on cleanup items and areas that were cleaned up, it's hard to beat that.
With the evidence shown and her alibi exposed as a lie, it is now up to the jury to decide Marlene Johnson's fate.
I felt like the verdict would come back quickly. It came back more quickly than I even imagined. The jury came back after 45 minutes and said that Marlene Johnson was guilty. So yes, that's fully what I was expecting, and I think that's what everybody in the courtroom was expecting. There was no surprise there. They didn't come back with questions like juries will do sometimes. They took their time, they elected a foreman, they voted, that was it.
She fell out onto the floor as if she had passed out and was having a fainting episode, and the judge said, "Stand her up. She's going to hear my order. It is my order, ma'am, that you will die in prison."
She was sentenced to life with no chances of parole.
She'll spend her life in prison and she'll get out when she's dead.
Very fortunate that she was not pursued on the capital murder cases, because if anything is evil, this crime was evil. And if anybody deserves to be put to death for a crime, it'd be hard-pressed to find a crime more violent than this one. She thought she was going to get away with it. She definitely did not leave the scene the way she prepared beforehand. In other words, When you make maps and you make details and you hire private investigators, that was a very thorough process she went through. But after she did the crime, it's like all the planning stopped. It seems like she was obsessed and planned beforehand, but really didn't plan for what am I going to do after the murder. You would think that there would be just as much planning on the afterthought as there was beforehand. The body wasn't removed. The scene really wasn't cleaned up as well.
I would describe Marlene Johnson as a person totally without conscience and without any respect for her fellow man. She didn't seem to be sorry to the Pierce family for what they had lost. Even if you're innocent, you can feel bad for a victim's family. I don't think there was any of that. She just seemed to be devoid of any positive attributes.
The motives on this case was anger and jealousy, and enough so that you commit a murder in such a violent manner. Take a knife, a kitchen knife, and assault someone numerous times to the point that you break the knife off in their neck. This is very personal. This is a lot of anger. This tells me as an investigator, there's hatred, there's anger here, there's evil here, there's intention here. And I think that was exactly what her personality was. It was a compulsive personality of jealousy and of paranoia. The sheriff's department at the time, Sheriff Kevin Alton, lead detective Chad Moose, and Carl Dangerfield had done a great job. The media knew the situations of this case. There was a lot of coverage of this case. It was very well known. I think it was a good picture of what law enforcement can do in a fast amount of time to bring a very violent person to justice.
It was actually one of the more interesting cases. It's certainly one of the most nonsensical ones that I've ever experienced. There's been a few of those over my career, but this one, I can't make sense of it at all.
It's almost impossible for a victim's family to recuperate from this, because every Christmas that you have, every Thanksgiving that you have, every birthday you have, your loved one's not there. And the only thing that is there are the memories that you have, or the good memories that you've had with them through the years. But to die a death so violent, to die a death so painfully brutal, that also lingers in the family members' minds, knowing that their loved one's last few breaths on this earth were horrific, that they were terrorizing breaths. As a family member, I don't know if I would ever be able to get that out of my mind, that my loved one passed away in such a terrible manner.
She doesn't deserve to live. She took the life of a wonderful person for no real reason.
September 2015, Dallas, Texas. Police are called to a garage in a high-end apartment complex. A body has been found.
It was almost like an execution-style murder. I mean, she had no warning that this was coming.
The bullet entered in the back of her skull and actually came out underneath her chin area.
But the profile of the victim and the manner of death lead investigators to believe that this is more than a random shooting.
I felt like there was more to the story. There was no random circumstance that caused this murder, that they were there for a specific reason and they were waiting on our victim.
What detectives soon uncover is a complex conspiracy.
Just the lengths that someone would go to try to get back with an ex-boyfriend.
I don't think she even thought about covering her tracks. It was all about getting this done. This focus of, I need to get Kendra Hatcher out of the way so I can get Ricky back.
Unfortunately, there are people in this world who would kill another human being and not give it a second thought.
This is the story of the tragic murder of Kendra Hatcher,
the detailed and methodical search for her killer, and a motive which police soon learn was triggered by jealousy and rage. It's just after 8 p.m. on the evening of September 2nd, 2015. Police respond to a 911 call from a luxurious high-rise apartment building in Dallas's Uptown.
Dallas 911, where's emergency?
Hi, someone just got shot in the parking lot of the Gables Park 17. All I heard was screaming and then a loud pop, and then I saw her laying on the floor and it was like blood coming out of her neck. The people, they had a mask on, and I think it was a black Jeep Cherokee.
I responded to that and was told by the officers that were securing the scene outside that there was someone that was deceased inside of the parking lot.
I saw a white Toyota Camry pulled in a parking space. The driver's side of the vehicle, the victim was laying on the ground. There was a pool of blood around her head.
She was dressed in black doctor's scrubs, and her name was embroidered on the front of her shirt.
It was definite that she had been shot. Next to the body, there was a magazine from a handgun, a spent round, and a shell casing.
The police request the attendance of the medical examiner.
The medical examiner did arrive at the scene, and he was able to confirm that she was deceased from one gunshot wound to the head. The bullet entered in the back of her skull and actually came out underneath her chin area.
The police have already been able to confirm the identity of the deceased.
The officers, prior to my arrival, checked the license plate on the car, and that came back as Kendra Hatcher being the owner of the vehicle, which matched what was on her shirt also.
Detectives now begin to examine what evidence they can find.
The cell phone at the scene was given to the homicide investigators. Obviously, they wanted to find out what numbers had been recently called or dialed on that phone, what messages had come in. The pistol magazine, which was also found at the scene with 13 live rounds in it, I took back to our crime scene lab and processed for latent prints.
We looked for her purse, and we found out that her purse was missing. And so we just began doing our normal course of investigation, looking for witnesses and also video cameras inside the parking garage.
Officers established Kendra Hatcher's last movements.
I found out that Kendra was actually a resident in that building and that she was on her way home from work. September 2nd was her last day at work for a few days because she was going on a vacation.
Kendra's fiancé, Ricky Paniagua, soon arrives.
One of the most painful parts of this whole story that I think of is that Ricky, the fiancé, was coming back into the apartment complex with dinner, and there was something going on. There were like police ropes and sirens and things were going on. He didn't know what was going on.
After speaking with him for a couple minutes, Ricky was able to tell me that him and Kendra had been dating for several months, and he was meeting Kendra at her apartment that evening to have dinner. Once he found out that we found Kendra deceased, you could just see just the color go from his body. He almost went into a state of shock once he was able to connect the dots.
Police begin to piece together more information about Kendra.
She had a very humble life growing up. Her mother owned a blanket shop in Springfield, Illinois. She was a cheerleader in high school, and she also was very devoted to her religion.
She was a rising star in her world of dentistry. She was someone that helped many people.
She worked with a clinic in the mid-cities of between Dallas and Fort Worth that specialized in lower-income kids because she wanted to help kids.
She also volunteered her time giving back to poor children in South America, donating her abilities as a dentist and her time and her effort to help kids that couldn't afford dentistry.
In recent months, Ricky and Kendra have become very close.
She had told her family that she was super excited about meeting this guy. She said that they're clicking and that, he's a dermatologist and that they would probably end up moving in a year or so after his residency ended. And she just seemed to be really super happy and excited about life.
The most immediate clue to what has happened to Kendra comes from the footage captured on the apartment complex's security camera system.
On the surveillance footage, we were able to see the victim come in to the parking garage and go to a normal parking space. We also found a footage of an older model Jeep Cherokee. This Jeep Cherokee was waiting in the visitor portion of the parking garage, and they followed another vehicle in and parked in a parking space before our victim got there.
She started to get out of her car. An assailant walked up and basically executed her, shot her in the head, took her purse, and fled.
The individual walked back to the back seat of the Jeep. The Jeep went out the wrong direction in the parking garage, made a U-turn, and then they exited.
But there are limitations to what the police can see on the CCTV.
After looking at the video, there was no way we could tell what kind of license plate was on that vehicle. And we had information that it may have been a paper tag.
Police feel the public might be able to help them.
They made the decision to release that tape to the public and say, hey, has anybody seen this vehicle, or do you know what's going on, or this is, this is very much of interest to us. And I think that was very, very key for them because that helped move the case along.
I felt like there was more to the story. There was no random circumstance that caused this murder, that they were there for a specific reason and they were waiting on our victim.
Police have some security footage, a murdered woman and a distraught fiancé. But they have little else to point to a motive for what clearly is the clinical killing of Kendra Hatcher. Dallas, Texas, 2015. Police are investigating the murder of 35-year-old dentist Kendra Hatcher. Most of the incident has been caught on security footage. Detectives have released the tape publicly in the hopes it might elicit a response and information. It does.
The media interest, it did help the case, obviously. I mean, when the news footage of the Jeep Cherokee leaving the garage, that jump-started the investigation when the owner called in.
The man is Jose Luis Ortiz, and he claims he lent his Jeep to a friend, Brenda Delgado.
Jose called in and said that he loaned his Jeep the same day of the murder to Brenda Delgado. Jose actually gave us a phone number for Brenda, and we called her. She told us, I'm house sitting for a friend over in Irving, and I don't have a ride, but if you can come pick me up, I'll come talk with you.
With this connection to the vehicle, Brenda Delgado immediately becomes a person of interest. Detectives try to establish more about her and her background.
Her parents immigrated from Mexico to America, so she still had dual citizenship in both countries. They were good working class folks. She graduated from an area high school. There wasn't money to go to college, so she started working. She got interested in the dental field. She was coming back to school and slowly finishing dental hygienist school when she was in her 30s.
The interesting thing about Brenda Delgado is that she is the former girlfriend of Ricky, the fiancé of Kendra Hatcher.
She had been with Mr. Paniagua several times, dating him. They broke it off. He then met Kendra Hatcher.
Brenda was, by all means, crazy in love with him, fascinated by him. They met the first time, got together, had a relationship. He broke it off. And then at some point after that, they started to get together casually. I would assume that meant they were probably hooking up, but it wasn't anything more. It wasn't a romantic relationship or a long-term relationship.
However, However, Brenda doesn't see things that way.
There were times where she would seem emotionally unstable. There would be times where she would be overly clingy and just kind of overly attached to him. And I felt like, that kind of fit in with the theme on this case, more so than a robbery.
It appears her view of the relationship has become obsessive.
He would be out for a run on Katy Trail here in Dallas, and she would suddenly run into him, make it appear that it was coincidental when in fact it wasn't. She was stalking him. So I think at that point she was just obsessed and she wanted to get him back any way she could.
For police, it's time to get face to face with Brenda Delgado.
Brenda gets called in for a voluntary interview, and she's cooperative. The Dallas police, smart as a bug, those folks taped everything.
Brenda gives the detectives her version of how she spent Wednesday, September 2nd, the day Kendra Hatcher was murdered.
Wednesday, I was in Carrollton,
Okay.
and I studied from maybe 12 all the way to about 6. And then from 6 we went to Fuzzy's. We had some tacos at Fuzzy's in Carrollton.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Who were you studying with?
Billy, this guy, a classmate.
Okay. So how'd you get to Carrollton?
I got a ride to Carrollton.
Okay. Who gave you a ride?
Who gave me a ride? My friend, Crystal.
Crystal?
Mm-hmm.
She told me that early that morning she met up with her friend Crystal. They were having some problems with their vehicle, and she took it to Jose's shop. Jose's a mechanic. Jose looked at it and told her that he needed to work on it, and she borrowed his Jeep. She said that she had a study date that day with some friends, and Crystal dropped her off at a public library, and she spent most of the day studying. She also told me that the library had cameras, and it also had a sign-in log that I could check for her signature.
This level of detail immediately raises a red flag.
Most people don't pay attention to locations having cameras or sign-in logs. It was like it was already pre-formatted.
Brenda can also supply very specific details about where she was at the time of Kendra's death.
When I go to Chili's.
How did you get to the Chili's?
Billy took me.
Billy gave you a ride at Chili's?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have the receipt in my bag. I can tell you exactly. That's all my clothes down.
Okay.
She probably figured if she just showed the receipt, an officer would say, sure, you weren't there, thank you, and that would be over. Fortunately, that's not the way it works in the world of crime.
Most people, when they come down and talk about murder, they're really nervous and kind of taken back. Either they're going to be overwhelmed emotionally because someone lost their life. They're going to be afraid because they're being questioned at a homicide investigation. She didn't seem to match any of those descriptions. She was very cool, calm, and collected, and very organized.
Detectives begin to get more specific with Delgado.
This is the picture of the young lady that got killed. Never seen her before?
I've never seen her.
Okay.
First, they started with Kendra Hatcher. Do you know this person? No, I've never met her. Well, she's engaged to Ricky Patiago. Do you know him? Oh, well, yes, Ricky and I are very close, but we're just friends now.
Detective Barnes needs to find out more about the vehicle used when the murder occurred.
I began to press her on who would have this Jeep. So when I pressed her on her location and whether she was driving the Jeep, she pointed a finger at Crystal and said, you need to talk with her.
Detectives now bring Brenda's friend Crystal Cortez in for questioning.
So she is in the police headquarters at the same time Brenda is, and they're interviewing both of them, taping both of them, and then super helpful for information back and forth.
There was a lot of different stories from Crystal. The first version was that she was looking for a parking space because she was going out to eat at a nearby restaurant. And she just happened to park inside the parking garage at the Gable 17. And she heard a loud noise and decided to leave the parking garage.
When I was up there, I heard a shot. I have my son in the back. So I said, no, you know what? Let me get out. I'm coming out. There's a guy running with a mask right in front of me. He stops, he looks dead at me, and I'm just like, horrid. I'm shaking literally at this point because I have my son in the back.
I confronted her with the fact that I actually saw someone get out of her vehicle and walk towards Dr. Hatcher.
Immediately, Crystal's story changes.
Crystal starts making up stories about she was just driving along the park with her son, and this scary man jumped in and told her to drive or he was going to kill her. And then she drove to the apartment complex and had no idea what happened.
However, she's confronted with the fact that there's no sign of anyone who could be considered to be her son on the tape.
Who else was in the vehicle with you?
Just my son, and he was asleep in the back, honestly.
No. That's not going to work either. I want to be able to trust you, and I want to be able to believe you. And I know that what you're telling me is not true.
She switched up the story to be this friend of Brenda's and her drove into the apartment complex, and the motive was going to be robbery, and then she was just going to drive the getaway car, and they were going to be away with some money, and she was going to get $500, and they were going to scare Kendra.
But Crystal Cortez has done no more than implicate herself.
When Crystal admitted that Brenda paid her $500 to go to the parking garage with this unknown male who was armed with a firearm, she self-admitted she put herself at the crime scene. That was enough to charge her. We charged her with capital murder.
Meanwhile, Brenda is still being interviewed by detectives.
The more I watched Brenda Delgado, the more I just knew she was lying. They kept the film running when they would leave the room or do you want to take a bathroom break or do you want some snacks or whatever, so they were friendly to her. But there would be times when she was on camera by herself, the detectives were out of the room, talking to Crystal Cortez. She was just like, oh. And she was doing things like this, and I think she was realizing the trouble that she had stepped into and that what was happening while the detectives were interviewing her.
Agent Barnes now turns up the heat on Delgado.
I began pressing Brenda really hard about where she was at, what she was doing, and why they were there, and what they were there for. And I think that once I began pressing buttons, Brenda felt like she was gonna unravel and end up being charged, and she just asked for an attorney.
Brenda clearly hasn't been to the scene of the murder. Detectives don't have enough evidence to charge her, but instinctively they know she is involved in some way.
They felt they did not have enough to issue a warrant for arrest for murder, but they wanted to hold her. They ran her background check, and she had a whole bunch of parking violations, enough to be arrested.
Collectively, we decided it would be better to just put her in jail for her traffic tickets than to charge her with murder and have to release her if we couldn't find enough details to prove it at that point.
But Brenda has other plans.
As soon as somebody comes down here, or she on her own pays the $300 or $400 that's owed, whatever's the fine that's not paid, as soon as you pay that, they release you immediately. And so it's not like you're sticking them in jail on some kind of a serious charge where they're going to have to wait and see a judge, and you're going to have to go through at least an 18-hour process. You're putting her in there. She's going to be out potentially in a couple 2 to 4 hours, which she was.
We found out that she left jail. She called a taxi to a local hospital, and she called her father and asked her father to pick her up.
Within hours, Brenda Delgado flees the state and crosses the border into Mexico.
She already had her backup plan in place, and at that point, we were just playing catch-up.
Detectives now believe that Brenda Delgado is at the center of the murder of Kendra Hatcher.
All of the early indicators on this investigation seem to point back to Brenda. Jose didn't know Kendra. Crystal didn't know Kendra. It all pointed back at Brenda. Brenda had the motive to want Kendra dead.
In Dallas, Texas, police are hunting for Brenda Delgado, a suspect in the murder of 35-year-old dentist Kendra Hatcher. Delgado has fled to Mexico,
but investigators are continuing to question Crystal Cortez, Delgado's accomplice, who drove the Jeep from which the killer emerged to shoot Kendra. However, they are still trying to identify the shooter.
Just crunching down phone records between Brenda, Crystal. We also located a phone inside Brenda's apartment. We got phone records for that number, and all of these phones had a common phone number that they were communicating with. And we were able to locate that phone number and do some subpoenas for the phone records on that phone.
Police reach out to federal agencies for assistance.
The FBI got involved about a month after it happened. At the time, they hadn't identified the shooter in the case. They only knew him as Chris, so they were looking for help in that regard. They had a telephone number for Chris. We were able to obtain a search warrant to obtain the real-time location information associated with that phone. The pings on the phone brought us to an apartment complex in South Dallas.
That same day, Crystal is brought in for further questioning.
So there was the blue Sebring part right there.
Okay, was it an older looking Sebring?
No, this is like, it's your, maybe
like this color blue or dark blue?
No. It's a shiny blue.
She gives me a description of the shooter's car, and she said he drives a blue Chrysler Sebring. I picked my phone up and I called the FBI agents that were doing surveillance out in this parking lot and gave them the car description, and they told me that they see the car in the same parking lot. By watching the phone pings, they noticed the phone started moving, and they also noticed that the blue Chrysler Sebring was moving at the same time that the cell phone was moving. And it pulls over in a parking lot a couple blocks away from this apartment complex, and they walk up to him and make contact.
The man is Christopher Love. He is taken into custody and the car is impounded.
The car was towed to the auto pound, and I began interviewing Christopher Love. I interviewed him all the way through the course of the night into the early morning hours of October 2nd.
Searching the car, they didn't really find anything, and it was a little bit of a dead end.
Detectives have drawn a blank, so they turn to another police resource to intensify the investigation.
A canine that was in training at the time was brought to the Dallas Auto Pound. The canine had been trained to find explosives. That could be anywhere from gunpowder to bomb material C4.
They sniffed the car. The dog wisely stopped at a couple places. They found some residue, but they didn't find enough evidence yet. And then the dog zoomed in on the console in between the driver's and passenger seat, up one side and down the other. So that was super helpful. The investigators were able to remove the panel, and lo and behold, what's in there? A gun.
Christopher Love is confronted with what the canine has managed to uncover.
Once I showed him a picture of the firearm, it was like somebody letting the air out of a balloon. His body language, he just kind of sunk down in his chair. His head dropped. He tells me, okay. I was there. I was with Crystal. I got out of the Jeep to walk over to get Kendra's purse, and Crystal fired a shot from the Jeep out the window, and it hit Kendra. And he goes back into the Jeep and they drive away.
But Detective Barnes knows better.
I saw the video, and what he was describing was a scene out of a James Bond movie. There was no way that Crystal could throw the car in reverse, shoot out a passenger window while backing up, hit someone in the head, and one shot get it done. And also the magazine to the firearm was laying next to the body. So I knew that my shooter was there close range and standing beside Kendra whenever she died. There's a video camera from the parking garage on the other side. And that's how I know which side of the vehicle you got out of. And only one person got out of that vehicle.
I hopped in the house.
That one person that got out, the one person that got out of that vehicle was you. I actually pressed him a little bit about being the shooter. And when he didn't feel like there was any way out, and there's no way to explain it other than to tell the truth, he asked for a lawyer. Well, I can tell you, man, that as far as this thing goes, that So once he terminated the interview, I went back to my desk and began typing his murder warrant, capital murder warrant, and he knocked on the door again. He wanted to sit and talk with me, and I told him I had to read his Miranda warning again if he wanted to talk, and he said okay. And he just wanted to ask me one question. He wanted to know, why did we let Brenda go? I thought it was pretty significant. I thought that was him saying, hey, you got me, now I want you to get her.
Crystal Cortez is also bowing to the inevitable.
I really want to go home with my baby.
You're not trying to cover for
No, I'm not
anybody?
covering anybody. I don't want nothing to do with this. I want to go home now. I really do. I want to go to my baby, okay?
I understand that.
I'm trying to, I'm helping you guys with everything I can. I just want to go home to Ivan, okay? I know you guys are trying to help me. I'm trying to help you out. I'm not trying to cover for anybody.
So Crystal was charged with capital murder. At some point, she agreed to a deal. The deal was, if you are truthful and if you can testify against Brenda, we will recommend you for 35 years to life. You will be pleading guilty to capital murder.
They needed Crystal to get to Brenda. It's the only opportunity for her. 17 and a half years, you're eligible for parole. You may or may not get it, but you're eligible. She's got a child. She's got to be thinking about a whole lot of things, and she doesn't want to be locked up till the day she dies.
She was the one that kind of put the pieces together for law enforcement, kind of explained what happened and allowed law enforcement to arrest the other people that were involved in it.
Detectives know they have Crystal and Christopher, but now the spotlight turns to Brenda Delgado. They strongly suspect that she has manipulated the other two.
One of the things that I learned working this case, that Brenda was very good at reading people. She was able to sit down with someone, figure out who that person was, figure out where they were at in life, and specifically what they needed in life.
It was a business transaction for them. Should we beat him up? Should we kill her? Should we... they just handled it as if it was business.
She actually offered Crystal $500. At the time, Crystal was a single mother. She was out of work because her vehicle wasn't working, and she needed some mechanic work done to her vehicle, and she didn't have the money to get it done. Brenda was able to figure out that she needed money to be able to go to work every day and take care of her child, and so she just kind of dangled that carrot in front of Crystal to get her to participate in this murder.
And it is becoming apparent that Brenda had lied to Christopher in order to manipulate him even further.
Christopher Love was a self-proclaimed low-level drug dealer that just moved to this Dallas area, and he wanted to be Scarface. He was looking forward to being the next up-and-coming drug dealer in Dallas, and Brenda picked up on that, and that's what she offered him. She told Christopher that she was part of the drug cartel and that Kendra was actually stealing drugs from the cartel, and if he participated in this murder, that he'd get a lifetime supply of drugs.
At the center of everything appears to be Brenda's jealousy of Ricky's newfound happiness with Kendra.
I think her obsession with Kendra Hatcher and losing Dr. Paniagua was stronger than anything she could think of. She just had one goal in mind, and that was to either hurt Dr. Paniagua, which was one of the very first things that came into their minds, or remove Kendra Hatcher from the picture.
On Brenda's phone, we looked into the notes portion of her phone, and we found an email address for Ricardo and also a password. Based on our interviews with Crystal told us that Brenda was able to track Ricardo, and she was able to know where he was at.
When Ricky and Brenda were hooking up the second time around, Ricky was still helping her, so they had a joint cell phone account, and apparently that account gave her access to his phone online. She had put tracking software on his phone. She was able to know where that phone was, where he was.
She would find his location and she would go and watch him. And then she would go have casual encounters where she would randomly bump into him and have conversations with him.
And her obsession also extended to Kendra.
In Brenda's phone, she had a bunch of pictures and videos she downloaded from Kendra's Facebook page. She had been stalking Ricardo and Kendra at the same time, just kind of staying up with their relationship. And I think she used social media as a way just to kind of figure out what they were doing.
It is becoming clear that Brenda was going to do whatever it took to achieve her objective.
Not only had she approached Crystal Cortez and Christopher Love, we interviewed some people that she had approached before about trying to convince them to do the same thing. Namely, her cousin, having him attack Kendra Hatcher with a baseball bat. He ultimately declined to do so. So she had been trying to find someone who would carry this out for some time.
Crystal had got in deep and was doing what Brenda wanted.
And speaking with Crystal, she told me that she started going around just talking to people that they knew about, where they could get a gun, and also if they would be willing to help them in this murder. And through a mutual friend, a gentleman by the name of Kelly Ellis, Kelly knew Christopher Love and he introduced them.
For whatever reason, they just fell in and the ball started rolling and Crystal started agreeing to these things, and she found a shooter for Brenda. She agreed to drive the getaway vehicle. She helped Brenda get rid of evidence after the fact for $500 and some drugs.
Delgado was across the border, in her mind, safe from the authority of U.S. law enforcement.
My arrest authority ends in the state of Texas, and I think Brenda knew that. She felt like she was out of reach of the Dallas Police Department. But what she didn't plan for was that we have a partnership with the FBI, and they've got worldwide jurisdiction.
When people try to flee the U.S. to another country to escape justice, that always is a thorn in my side. So I always give those cases a little extra attention because I want to make sure that these people get caught and brought back to the U.S. I don't want people thinking that they can flee our borders and not answer the charges that are brought against them.
The FBI felt like the longer that she was free, the longer that she was evading law enforcement, that we were at risk for her committing another offense.
Dallas police now moved to make Brenda Delgado an international fugitive from justice.
We were able to get her on the FBI most wanted list. I was pretty excited about it because I knew that I would get my shot at her again.
In 2016, Dallas police and the FBI are continuing their investigation into the murder of 35-year-old dentist Kendra Hatcher. Investigators have apprehended the man who pulled the trigger, Christopher Love, and the getaway driver, Crystal Cortez. However, they are still searching for the woman they believe orchestrated the crime, Brenda Delgado, who is a fugitive in Mexico and on the FBI's most wanted list. Detectives and agents now intensify their search for Delgado.
We started interviewing extended family members to see if we could get any cooperation from them. Initially, we weren't successful. They didn't want to cooperate, but ultimately some of them did. And that was very helpful in ultimately locating her.
I believe the phone was instrumental in tracking. They were able to pick up who she was calling and where money transfers were being made for her to have money to live on out there.
We received information that her family was sending her money via some money transfer business, and we were able to corroborate some of that. We saw some money going down to a state in Mexico where we knew she had relatives.
This information is further corroborated by a tip directly to investigators.
We received information that Brenda was at a specific location in Mexico, and the tipster began providing detailed information of where Brenda was at.
It allowed us to identify her exact location in Mexico, and we relayed that to Mexican Interpol officers, and they arrested her, within hours after we passed on that information.
Texas authorities moved to extradite Brenda Delgado from Mexico to the United States.
It's a long process to do that. I mean, Our State Department has to reach out to whoever's the comparable authority in Mexico City. I mean, I don't remember how long that process took, but I mean 6 months to a year. I mean, it was a good while.
For the process to work, certain conditions must be met.
Brenda was a dual citizen, Mexico citizenship and American citizenship. And Mexico has a standing policy that they do not extradite any of their nationals, any of their citizens, into a death penalty situation.
The deal was that she would not be put to death here in the States. So in order for us to apprehend her and bring her back, we had to agree to that.
We flew to Mexico on October 5th of 2016. We met Mexican authorities in a hangar at the airport. We searched her. We placed the restraints on her that she would be wearing on the flight. We were able to board the flight before any of the other passengers through the back entrance and flew back to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport nonstop.
I actually met her when she arrived here. I was the first face that she saw when she walked in the airport hangar. I'm a pretty competitive person, and even though I didn't get a chance to interview her again, in my mind, I was like, I told you I was gonna get you.
Prosecutors now need to prepare for 3 trials: Brenda Delgado, Crystal Cortez, and Christopher Love.
I've been working in the Dallas Homicide Unit for a little over 9 years. And out of every murderer that I've come across, Christopher Love is about as cold as any murderer that I've dealt with. No sign of remorse, no sign of emotion, no sign of regret.
This is a vicious, vicious, vicious person.
Christopher Love was sentenced to death. He's still on death row from what I understand, and I don't know if a date's been set yet for that.
Crystal Cortez's fate has already been more or less agreed.
Crystal was charged with capital murder as well, based on her agreement to testify against Christopher and also to testify against Brenda. She was given 35 years in prison.
In the case of Brenda Delgado, prosecutors paint a picture of a ruthless manipulator.
They did a great job at pointing out the specific facts of this investigation and just kind of like laying out who Brenda was. You know, that she's not just this pretty face that you see sitting in a courtroom, that this lady's a monster.
I don't think she even thought much about covering her tracks. It was all about getting this done. This focus of, I need to get Kendra Hatcher out of the way so I can get Ricky back.
Brenda had a very blank look on her face, almost like she was in disbelief that she was actually sitting in this courtroom and that she was being held accountable for what she did.
I don't really know that she felt right and wrong. I don't really know that she felt any guilt. The best word I can come up with is sociopathic.
She just appeared to be very nonchalant and like everything was okay, and it would be until the very end.
When the jury deliberate, they aren't long about coming to a decision.
So I was going down the escalator, and this is, we're less than 20 minutes since the jury went out, and I got a text message, we've got a verdict.
I think we startled some folks. We came back in a half an hour. It was not flippant, however. It was not off the cuff. We came back into the jury room, and someone suggested that we take a sample vote. This is the gut check vote. Let's just write down what we think, and then we'll start talking about it. So a woman volunteered to capture the notes. We all wrote down what we thought, and she opened them up, and they were all in one pile, one after the other. Guilty, 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 guilty.
That's very unusual. In a capital murder case, for the jury to come back, I heard estimates of 18 to 20 minutes that they deliberated. Yeah, that's unheard of. So they were convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that she committed this crime. First and foremost, this was a Dallas Police Department homicide investigation. And everybody understood their roles, and everybody understood that the primary goal was to identify everybody who was involved in this murder for hire and to get everybody arrested and in a courtroom to face the charges against them. And I think every agency did a great job at that.
I think working cases like this just makes it hard for you to trust individuals. But on a positive note, it's kind of offset by all the positives that I learned from working with the family and also the detectives on this case.
There may be a victory of sorts in the convictions, but for the family of Kendra Hatcher, there is just loss.
The thing that bothered me the most about this case was this could have been anyone. Kendra is a truly innocent victim, and she never saw any of this coming. For her to be ambushed and assassinated in a parking garage like an animal, it bothered me. And it is one of those things that you just never forget.
It's such a senseless, tragic loss of life that didn't need to happen. Just the lengths that someone would go to try to get back with an ex-boyfriend. That's very chilling, and it's a stark reminder of kind of the world we live in.
Nothing anyone can do will bring Kendra Hatcher back, and for her family, the pain of losing her endures.
For the family, I don't feel there's closure. The word is a great word. We hear it and we think curtains are shut and we can no longer see what's behind them. But I do not believe that there is true closure in a case like this.
Their daughter, sister, was taken from them in an instant, without any warning and without any reason. So I don't know how you come to terms with that. It's got to be extremely difficult.
We can never bring back Kendra, but we can say, hey, we got the people that were responsible.
On March 22nd, 2018, police receive a call informing them that a farmer in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, has reported the arrival of a distressed young woman named Ezra McCandless at his doorstep.
County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
This is Don Sipple calling, and I have a young lady that just came to my house and somebody attacked her, and she needs a doctor. Her clothes are all torn.
She was covered in mud up to her knees. She had blood on her clothing. She was very distraught, seemed rather confused.
It wasn't until later on, when she was able to take a shower at the hospital, that some of her memories seemed to come back to her, and that's when she told investigators that she was attacked by Alex Woodworth.
Alex Woodworth is a local substitute teacher, but when police attempt to locate him, they draw a blank.
We couldn't find him, so we decided to go out there and talk to Don Sipple and see if there was anything else that we could learn. And as I was standing on the roadway, I noticed footprints in the mud.
Detectives follow the footprints and come to an abandoned vehicle stuck in the mud. It belongs to Ezra McCandless, and slumped in the footwell of her car is the lifeless body of Alex Woodworth.
You've got a victim stabbed 16 times. This would have absolutely been a textbook case of rage killing.
I think what happened was premeditated.
This was an attack that he didn't see coming.
An ex-boyfriend of Ezra McCandless comes forward. His name is Jason Mengel.
At the same time that came about, Jason Mengel came to the police department. He mentioned that earlier in the day, he went to Racy's coffee shop, and while he was there, as he described it, she burst through the door, said that she had a crazy look in her eyes.
We started to learn that there was a love triangle between Alex, Jason Mengel, in Ezra.
Ultimately, Ezra wanted to be with was Jason.
She needed to try and cut Alex out of the mix, and she got wrapped up in her own mind and did a horrible thing.
But Ezra McCandless is claiming self-defense. Is it even possible that she could be consumed by jealousy to the point of murder?
I think a scorned woman is definitely capable of committing some of the worst crimes there are.
Eau Claire, Wisconsin, the area is buzzing with creativity, full of trendy bars and a community of creatives who gather at Racy Delane's Coffee Lounge.
Eau Claire's been described as being a big little town, meaning in a sense it's pretty big geographically, but the people who live there all seem to know each other, and it seems to be a pretty nice place to live and build a community.
Eau Claire is a college town, so there is a younger demographic here, but there's also a lot of young families because people do come here for the college, love the community, and they'll stay here and they'll raise their families. So it's a very family-oriented place. Racy's is a coffee shop that is near campus. It's near the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I like to equate it as almost like a central perk from the show Friends. It's that cozy, that little bit of artsy, little bit of alternative, that kind of vibe. So it's a very, very welcoming, open coffee shop.
In March 2018, around 4:15 p.m., a young woman named Ezra McCandless arrives at the doorstep of dairy farmer Don Sipple in the rural area of Springbrook, Eau Claire.
At the time, when Ezra pounded on his front door, he was eating dinner. And when he opens the door, Ezra was standing there claiming to have been attacked.
County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
This is Don Sipple calling, and I have a young lady that just came to my house, and somebody attacked her, and she needs a doctor. Her clothes are all torn, and...
Okay, and she's by herself?
She's by herself. She walked to my house here just recently.
She was extremely upset. She was covered in bruises. She had some blood, particularly around her mouth. And when Don Sipple was just trying to get some basic information from her, she really couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She didn't know who attacked her. She just kept saying she's hurting everywhere and she needed help.
She gets transferred to Mayo Hospital here in Eau Claire. Officer Corey Reeves goes and talks to her, and then Ezra's admitted into the hospital for her safety and to make sure she's okay from this traumatic incident.
I went to the hospital to speak with Deputy Shields and to help interview Ezra in her emergency room. And she provided the name Monica Carlin to Deputy Shields, so there was some issues trying to get an actual identification on her. Monica Carlin was her name before, and then she had it legally changed to Ezra McCandless.
Not only is there confusion over Ezra McCandless's name, but detectives also discover she has had a challenging childhood.
She's a 19-year-old teenage girl that dropped out of college who ended up in Eau Claire because life sort of drifted her there. She was born to a teen mom. Her mom was just 14 years old when she got pregnant and gave birth to Ezra. So that's, from the beginning, just a really hard way to grow up and to start your life. So the struggles early on were definitely there for Ezra, being born to such a young mother. And it sort of seemed to want to start somewhere fresh in life and really create her own identity. Ezra was a very artistic person. She enjoyed the creative side to herself, and she even used her own car, a Chevy Impala, to be sort of her canvas.
Sergeant Corey Reeves conducts an interview with Ezra McCandless.
She was curled up in a hospital bed. She had the blanket pulled up to her face. Really, the only part of her that I could see was her nose and her eyes, and she was essentially in the fetal position on the bed until I came in and tried to talk to her. At that point, she sat up on the bed. She started rocking back and forth. She still had the blankets up by her mouth. She repeated several times, "It was dark and scary." She didn't have a great memory about what had happened or where she was that day.
She was crying but didn't see any tears. There were cuts in her pants to where you could see cuts into her body, into her flesh. The words boy were carved in her arm. And she had first said that Alex Woodworth was the one who did it.
She said she was sitting in the passenger seat. Alex was sitting in the driver's seat, and he reached over, held her arm down, and took out a knife, and then carved the word boy into her arm. And she said that's what he referred to me as his boy.
This turned out to be very significant to the story and to the investigation because come to find out that when Ezra was younger, when she was in high school, she experienced a lot of gender identity issues. She struggled with thinking whether she was a male or she was a female, and she really struggled with how not only she identified herself, but also how she wanted other people to identify her. So having the word boy carved into her arm was really sort of significant of the gender issues that she experienced younger in her life.
Boy was written from starting at the elbow was the letter B and down to the wrist was the Y. And it was written as if it was done with the right hand. If Alex would have done it, it would have been completely backwards. It would have been, the B would have been at the wrist and the Y would have been up at the elbow. So that didn't make sense.
Ezra requests that her ex-boyfriend, Jason Mengel, come to the hospital. Detectives then interview Mengel at the police department.
Jason mentioned that he was in the military, that he was deployed fairly often for training. He talked about his relationship with Ezra a little bit. He was 33 years old, she was 19 years old. They dated on and off again for 9 months. He said that they would refer to each other as husband and wife, even though they weren't actually married. More recently, he'd been deployed, and Ezra told him that she no longer wanted to be with him. He said he was sad about this, but that they continued to communicate with each other. He learned that she started seeing Alex. He knew that she dated him before, and he mentioned that earlier in the day, he went to Racy's coffee shop, and while he was there, as he described it, she burst through the door, said that she had a crazy look in her eyes. He tried to talk to her. She basically just shrugged him off. I believe she wanted to meet with Alex to talk to him. She wanted to get a hat back from his apartment and then was out the door.
Jason decided to ride his bicycle to Alex's house. And that's when he saw Ezra's car parked out front and started sort of pacing back and forth in front of Alex's house, waiting for Ezra or Alex to come outside. And after about 45 minutes of waiting, he decided to go into Alex's house himself to make sure everything was okay, because his conversation and interaction with Ezra was just seemed off earlier that day. Now, according to Jason, they were deep in conversation, seemed okay, maybe an intense conversation. So Jason decided to go back outside, where he was confronted with the police.
Somebody else called in a suspicion complaint on Jason standing there watching from a distance. Eau Claire Police Department arrived. Jason explained to them why he was there and what he was doing, and that he was concerned because Ezra was kind of not in the right state of mind.
I was paranoid because she had like fire in her eyes.
Okay.
So
Who's the girlfriend?
Ezra McCandless.
Okay.
I was just worried because
was the door standing open over there when you got there on the car?
I knocked like 3 times. I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear a scuffle or anything. So knocked, yelled, opened the door, and I heard her say, "Let him help you." let him help you. So then I said, hey, is everything okay? Is everyone all right now? I mean, I'm a medic in the military, so like, I was paranoid. I was paranoid that someone was going to do something irrational.
Okay. And they're in the house on the corner here, or?
Yeah, they're on. I think they're fine though. I mean, I don't know. I'm just.
I just saw the door to the car was standing open too.
Yeah, I wanted to turn her car off. Her car was running, so that's why I was like worried, because it was running, and I was like, okay, what's going on? Like, what's going on? Is everything okay?
Okay.
I don't think he's dangerous, but I don't know.
Do you know what his name is?
Alex Woodsworth. Okay. I think it's Woodsworth or Woodsworth.
Eventually, Eau Claire Police Department goes across the street and talks to Ezra and Alex, and kind of finds out what's going on. They kind of blow it off, and they get in their vehicle, Ezra's vehicle, and leave. And Jason's kind of left to, he actually has a conversation with them before they leave. I think Jason truly had a concern, what Ezra was up to that day.
But the burning question remains, with Ezra McCandless continuing to claim assault. Where is Alex Woodsworth? In 2018, Ezra McCandless arrives at a rural farm in Wisconsin, Eau Claire. Covered in blood, she is disoriented and unable to recall the details of her ordeal, but asserts that she was assaulted by her partner, Alex Woodworth. McCandless's ex-boyfriend Jason informs detectives that he had seen Alex earlier that day and that he and Alex had spoken. Detectives are currently unaware of Alex Woodworth's whereabouts and are actively working to locate him.
I remember sitting in our conference room and we were saying to each other, like, well, where is Alex in this? Because police officers had contact with Alex, and we're starting to get concerned because she's in a condition that will lead us to believe that it's possible that something happened, and we can't find Alex. We started doing our work by contacting family. I remember calling Alex's mom. He's checked out of all the locations where he might be, according to his mom. I think one was the coffee shop, Racy Delaney's. Another one was the Joint, which is a tavern. And then the other one was his house on Cameron Street.
I went to Alex's house on Cameron Street in Eau Claire. He wasn't there. His roommate was there. His roommate didn't know where he was. His roommate tried calling Alex. Alex's phone went straight to voicemail. After that, we basically ran out of leads.
During the course of the investigation and interviewing people about Alex, everyone we talked to said he was a gentle person. He cared for Ezra. He loved Ezra. He, according to people, never in a fight, never harm anybody, willing to help everybody, loved everybody. If he was going to fight, it was going to be with words. He was going to school to become a philosopher and teach philosophy. That's what his dream was.
It wasn't until later that night that I went back to the police department and had a discussion with my commanding officer and expressed some concerns about Alex's whereabouts and the fact that we couldn't find Ezra's vehicle. Ezra remembered something about a frog statue. She mentioned Owen Park. Eau Claire has a statue tour where they rotate statues, part of a sculpture competition. And at that point, I remember that there was a frog statue in Owen Park. And she told me that she was at Owen Park sometime between 1 and 4 o'clock. I checked the cameras, and I never saw her vehicle or her enter or exit the park.
Unable to obtain a precise timeline from McCandless, the detectives decide to revisit Don Sippel's farm in Springbrook.
We kind of all determined that it's going to be worthwhile for us to head out to that farm, because if this girl's walking down a county road barefoot, covered in mud, possibly some blood on her, and in the condition that she was in, somebody probably saw her, even though it's a rural area and people drive up and down the roads there. So we were surprised that she had supposedly walked all the way up to this farmhouse and hadn't been seen by anybody. Our thoughts were she couldn't have come from very far, because if she had, there would have been other calls, this girl walking down the street. So we decided to go out there and talk to Don Sippel and kind of look around a little bit and see what, kind of get a lay of the land and see if there was anything else that we could learn. We knew what kind of car she had. We knew that her Chevy Impala was very distinctive. She had done a lot of artwork, I guess you could say, drawing on the vehicle. So it was very easy to identify. It's white, so it should stick out. As that's happening, I stayed down on the road, which was a pretty good distance from the house. I'd say maybe 100 yards. As I was sitting there, I got out of my vehicle. I was just bored because they were up doing the interview, and I wanted to look around and see if there was anything maybe in the ditches along the road that she might have dropped. As I was doing that, I could see a farm access road that went off to the south, off of the road that I was on. Springtime, so there's a lot of mud and water runoff. And as I was standing on the roadway, I noticed footprints in the mud. As I got closer and looked at them, I could see that the footprints were not shoe impressions. They were, clearly a barefoot or a socked foot. So I called Detective Prock, and as they were interviewing Mr. Sipple, and I just said, hey, I got some footprints here in the mud. I think we need to investigate this further. And they were close enough in distance to the Sipple house that it's entirely possible she made it from that road to his house without a car going by. So we thought that these are probably her footprints coming out of the woods. So I waited for the other detectives to come down. I had some binoculars in my detective vehicle, and we started making our way up the dirt road and kind of crested a hill, and we could see Ezra's vehicle. My binoculars, I could see that the vehicle was stuck in some mud, probably 100 yards, 200 yards away. And there's a bunch of stuff outside the vehicle, like just random things from your car that looked like they were kind of just strewn about on the ground around the vehicle. And I could see what appeared to be the upper torso of a human body sticking out the back driver's side open door of the vehicle.
They took video and photographs as they walked into the area where this vehicle was located. An old military type trailer that was parked back in there in this area. So this vehicle stuck in the mud, Chevy Impala, all painted very odd things on the outside of their vehicle. The painting on her vehicle was a bird riding a bicycle on the roof of her car that she apparently had painted herself.
The upper half of his body was hanging out the rear driver's side door. The lower half of his body was in the footwell of the rear driver's side. He was clearly deceased. Looked like he had a scarf around his neck. We also noticed that there was blood outside, and we could see that there was a bunch of items that were probably in the car scattered around.
There was a pillow laying there with like a fox, the face of a fox on it, and a muddy footprint on that pillow, a deer antler laying there next to the head of this victim, until we looked into it a little bit more, and obviously there was significantly more wounds than what a deer antler would cause, and a pair of boots laying there all bloody. Turned out they had blood on them, but and eventually find out those were Ezra McCandless's boots that were laying there in the middle of where this crime had taken place.
The victim is confirmed as 24-year-old Alex Woodworth, and his body is taken for an autopsy.
There was 16 different stab and slice wounds identified on him. We could identify, just from the initial photos, 3 different slices on his throat and multiple stab wounds, mostly on his left side and his rib cage, lower abdomen, right about his belt line. Most of his injuries were around his neck, his back, his sides, the groin, but nothing really on his forearms or on the palms of his hands, a defensive manner. He didn't put up a fight, is what it would tell us, that he was either attacked unsuspectingly. Me personally, if somebody's attacking me with a knife, they're going to have one heck of a fight on their hands. And it didn't appear that he probably defended himself very much.
Alex, unfortunately, would have been alive for probably a significant amount of time after the attack. The medical examiner later on determined that none of the stab wounds in and of themselves were fatal. So based on that evidence, he likely survived for a good amount of time. Again, we have the evidence of the scarf being wrapped around his neck, possibly as a way to try to stop the bleeding. And we know that his body was found half outside of the car. So was Ezra trying to put him back in the car? Was that his way of trying to escape and maybe try to get some help? But he definitely suffered. It wasn't a quick death.
Detectives move forward with a follow-up interview with McCandless, seeking to unravel the mystery behind the brutal killing. Is this 19-year-old woman an innocent victim, or is this story more sinister than it appears? In 2018, Ezra McCandless arrives at a rural Springbrook farm in Wisconsin, but is marked with the word boy superficially cut into her arm. Despite her claims of an attack by her lover Alex Woodworth, she is unable to recall the details.
March 24th of 2018, Dunn County asked that I assist with the interview of Ezra, mainly because I've already have rapport with her. I've talked to her at this time a handful of times about her previous cases. So I meet with her again at the hospital. We go into a conference room, and I have her sit by the door and tell her, you're free to leave at any time. We just need to talk about what happened. I'm trying to fill in the blanks. And so we sit and talk. And eventually I inform her that we have found Alex and her car. It was kind of shock. And so as we were talking, she started talking about how Alex came. She was in the car got stuck, and Alex came from behind her, and Alex tried cutting her pants off. And that's where the cuts in her pants were from. And then she also said the same thing about the cuts on her shirt, that he was trying to cut her shirt off.
He kept trying to grab me in the back of the car, so I just started to defend myself as fast as I could.
You said you had the knife. Where were you cutting him?
I just was going anywhere and everywhere I could.
Okay.
He just kept grabbing me and grabbing me and grabbing me.
The reason she said that she stabbed him so much was to get him to stop, because she said he kept on attacking her, and so she needed to stab him to stop him, because that's what her dad told her to do. We were able to figure out the knife was actually given to her from her father, that she had it in her car for defense. And after the incident took place, the stabbing of Alex, she took the knife with her, and the knife was eventually found in the ditch away from the car. She talked about how she tried to grab the knife with the blade to get it from her, and that's where the cut on her hands came from. And then she said that as they were in the car, she was fighting with him. He ended up dropping the knife, and that's when she was able to get a hold of the knife, and she stabbed him. If it's a defensive wound, and even think about it, if you're going to grab a knife, it's not going to be just like a little grab. You're going to grab onto that, and if it's a sharp knife and if someone pulls it, it's going to cut your hand wide open. And hers were as if you took your nail and scratched it across your palm of your hand a couple times. They were very superficial, no stitches. Basically, they put Band-Aids on them. And these were all documented by the emergency room doctor. And he even called them self-inflicted. And they weren't traumatic, they weren't inflicted by somebody else. No one's going to sit there and let someone carve a word into them and not be moving their arm, fighting or that. The lines were too perfectly straight. So once I confronted her with that, she admitted that she carved the word boy into her arm. When we pressed it, she said, I just wanted to remember. And that was it.
You didn't do that to you, did you? You carved the boy into your own arm. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
This was a shock to the community. This was not something that anyone had really experienced or heard about. And especially as more of the details of the case started to become public, when you're talking about the age of the victim, when you're talking about the age of Ezra, this really was something that rocked this community. I don't think anyone wants to think that a 19-year-old small stature female is capable of something like this. I think as a society, we just don't want to think they're capable of that.
Upon confessing to detectives that she disposed of the murder weapon, investigators study the evidence at the crime scene and observe additional discrepancies in her initial account.
We eventually started to piece it together that her story's BS. It's not making sense, and based off from his injuries, the one that really sticks in my mind is the 3 distinct cut wounds across his throat. That's not self-defense. That's fully intentionally of killing somebody. Stabbing somebody in the groin, in the lower abdomen, in the left side, in the back. There was clear intent to kill somebody with those wounds. You know, there's different theories. Did she try and get Alex after she stabbed him to death and slit his throat 3 times? Did she try and get him back into the car and try and get her car out of there to move the scene? Did he get in the car himself?
The biggest part of the investigation would have taken place right there in and around Ezra's car. Not just where Alex's body was discovered in the back seat, but also looking around the car. And I think during the course of the investigation, that's where they uncovered the most amount of evidence that seemed to contradict her story. For instance, finding the majority of Alex's blood outside of the car. Finding the blood outside the car is pretty telling because Ezra's story was that they were interacting inside of the car, and that's where she claimed to have stabbed him in self-defense. Well, that's problematic because investigators found the majority of the amount of blood outside of the car. If she was telling the truth about her story, the blood should have been found inside the car.
There's a bloody footprint on the roof of the car at an angle that just doesn't make sense. So obviously we know that Alex didn't put the muddy footprint on the ceiling of the car. That had to have come from Ezra because her boots were off and her socks were muddy. So, you know, did she try and drag Alex into the car to try and get the car moved and move the scene of the homicide so it wasn't discovered there? I think there was a significant time there that she really went, oh, what am I going to do now? He's dead in my car. I can't move my car. And I think there was, you know, maybe up to several hours that she sat there trying to figure out how to spin this tale and causing injuries to herself to make it look like she was attacked, that she didn't want to jab herself or stab herself significantly to cause herself too many wounds, so really all of her injuries were superficial scratches. So I think she spent a significant amount of time there after Alex was dead.
She took Alex's cell phone with him. She didn't have a cell phone of her own. Now, when investigators asked her what happened to Alex's cell phone because it wasn't with him inside the car, she originally said that she took it so she could call for help. But that was discovered later on to not be true because the cell phone was found broken, and which Ezra later claimed she fell, and that's how Alex's cell phone eventually broke. But there's no evidence suggesting that Ezra ever used Alex's phone to try to get help. If Ezra would have just walked away, it would have absolutely been prevented. Or even after the attack, if she would have just used Alex's cell phone to dial 911 and even say that she made a mistake, he probably would have survived, and we wouldn't be talking about a murder.
But what is the underlying motive behind the murder of Alex?
We want to find out what led up to this, like what caused this incident to occur. Was this self-defense? Was there a fight that occurred? Was there any kind of motive that she might have had for this to happen? We interviewed family, friends of both Ezra and Alex, some of Alex's professors, Alex's friends and family, and we started to learn that there was a kind of like a love triangle between Alex, Jason Mengel, and Ezra. We started to paint a picture that, Ezra was struggling. When you take all those things and put them together with the total picture here, to me, we were just dealing with a deeply disturbed woman who had an affinity for Jason Mengel to the point that she was willing to murder Alex Woodworth.
Ezra is someone that can pretty easily manipulate people. I think Ezra comes across as being this sweet, nice, artsy, creative young girl, but deep down, I don't really think that's who she is. But I think she's able to use that to manipulate people and to get people to like her and give her what she wants. But I think she can easily turn into a very different person when she's threatened. I don't think Ezra had it in her to ever walk away from this situation. I don't think she was ever willing to walk away from any of these relationships that she had with any of these people, because that would mean the attention was being taken away from her. And I don't think she's the type of person that's going to walk away from that.
All signs indicate that this was a surprise attack, driven by the desperation to control a love triangle gone wrong, with tragic consequences. In 2018, Ezra McCandless arrives at a rural Springbrook farm in Wisconsin, injured, bloodied, and bearing a superficial cut on her arm with the inscription "Boy." She claims that her lover, Alex Woodworth, restrained her and inflicted the injuries, but this statement is later proven false. Shortly thereafter, Alex Woodworth's lifeless body is found in the same area, with 16 stab wounds and no defensive injuries. This leads investigators to consider it an attack driven by a jealous desire to separate Alex from her relationship with Jason Mengel. Contrary to McCandless's version of events, the evidence discovered at the crime scene contradicts her narrative.
I think the impact of the local community was a little bit of shock because they were seen around the community. You know, they were at Racy's, they were at the Joint, they were at all of these places where the art community hung out, where a lot of people hung out. And so people had known them and recognized them. So I think the community seeing that was quite shocking. Obviously never know what's going on when, you know, a person's life next to you, but that all of this was going on, that was unsettling.
The Racy's community was thrilled. They wanted her gone. They wanted her away. That's a very tight-knit group of friends, community there, and they were in shock. They were saddened. Everyone loved Alex. They wanted Alex back, but unfortunately we couldn't do that. So the next best thing was her gone. They didn't want to see her ever again. And on April 6th, 2018, Ezra was arrested for first-degree intentional homicide. She was taken from the hospital and went to Dunn County Jail.
Detectives gather the evidence to prepare for trial.
She lawyered up. There wasn't much of an opportunity to talk to her much more other than her initial couple stories after she was confronted with finding her vehicle and Alex's body. Her family got an attorney involved right away and secured an attorney for her, and so there wasn't much of an opportunity to interview her anymore. The physical evidence kind of spoke for itself, but there also was a lot of questions about the physical evidence that we couldn't answer. You know, like, how did Alex end up in the car? You know, only Ezra knows that because Alex can't speak for himself anymore. You know, so I think we're pretty confident in our investigation going into this, not knowing exactly what Ezra's going to, what her defense attorney is going to claim at trial. But as an agency, I think we felt pretty comfortable. I think the DA, the prosecuting attorney, felt pretty comfortable going into this case with what we had. We had expert testimony lined up to show that these injuries to her were self-inflicted. It's a large, many pieces of a puzzle that you got to try and put together, present to the DA. The DA has to try and tell this story to a jury and convince them that what we have discovered through our investigation proves that she, you know, intentionally murdered him.
By October 2018, when the case went to trial and Ezra was charged with first-degree intentional murder, she surprisingly didn't show any remorse. I think she went into that trial still trying to play the victim in all of this, and she was determined to stick to her original story. It does not surprise me at all to find out that Ezra decided to take the stand in her own defense. Although most criminal defendants choose not to, the reason why it doesn't surprise me is because, by all accounts, Ezra liked the attention. She liked to be the star. She liked to be the center of everyone's attention. And I think by taking the stand and being able to tell her story directly from her mouth, I think she really enjoyed that. And I think She also thought that it was going to be a way for her to continue on this narrative and continue the lies that she had laid into foundation. She pretty much stuck to her original version that this was self-defense, that Alex was the one who had come on to her, that he had physically gotten on top of her, that he had a knife in his hand and he tried to cut her clothes off. And she basically saw no other way to get out of this in order to protect herself than to stab and defend herself. And I think she really wanted to portray herself in front of the jury as being this meek, sort of timid, friendly young girl. And I think she thought she was going to be able to use that to her advantage, because no jury is going to want to convict someone who looks and acts like Ezra McCandless did.
The sheer brutality of Alex's injuries in relation to the lack of injuries on Ezra. That would be the thing to me, looking back on it, that if I were looking at this as a juror and I was seeing that this woman walked away from this with no broken bones, very little in the way of actual injuries, some superficial stuff. But then you look at Alex and he's stabbed a countless number of times, many of which could have been fatal, and by somebody who was 30, 40 pounds smaller than he was. To me, that was the biggest piece right there, is just the brutality of it, and what I would say was probably the most important piece here.
I know the public opinion was that she appeared as though this wasn't so impactful for her. I think the jury made some comments that she did not seem remorseful about what she did. My understanding is that she wore her hair in different ways every single day that the trial went on, that it seemed like she was enjoying the attention that she was getting surrounding the trial. I had heard that when Jason was testifying, that she almost seemed like she was trying to get his attention while he was testifying, that she wore a sweater that he gave to her. Without having spoken to him, I guess I can't say too much about how he feels. I'm sure it's a mix of emotions between guilt and just sadness and confusion. He was very close with Ezra. I imagine that when you're calling someone your wife and they're referring to you as your husband, and then you find out that they stab someone to death, and then watch a trial take place and watch them get convicted of homicide, that's got to be very jarring. And again, like many other people involved in this case, I'm sure he took him a while to cope with everything that was happening.
She got all giddy and girlish looking at him. She got kind of all flustered, and I thought that was very bizarre. She wasn't believable. And obviously a 3-hour deliberation on a first-degree intentional homicide case by a jury, they didn't find her believable.
On November 1st, 2019, Ezra McCandless is convicted of first-degree intentional homicide for the murder of 24-year-old Alex Woodworth. She is later sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 50 years served.
I think she was in shock. I truly think that she thought she was going home at the end of the day. And she just stood there kind of stone-faced. She said she was sorry. She was sorry to the family, and that she loved Alex very much. I don't think the judge believed her. I mean, you stab someone 16 times and leave them to die. You didn't try to help them. You didn't call anyone to help them. You left them.
I think that comes down to how she testified, how she acted in the courtroom, the evidence that was there. I think that, they looked and examined from all sides, and they found her guilty.
Alex's parents, specifically his father, have publicly said that they do forgive Ezra for what she's done. Of course, forgiveness isn't going to bring their son back, but it probably helps them sleep a little bit better at night and helps them live with a sense of peace to be able to forgive her.
I actually look back on it and I'm proud of the work that we did, in the sense that somebody was eventually going to find that car and they were going to find Alex. But what evidence would have been lost as a result? How long would it have taken to find him? Maybe the knife's never recovered. Maybe the phone's never recovered. Footprint washes away. All this evidence that could have been lost. So I'm proud of the work that we as a team did that day. We kept working on it. It's very sad for the Woodworth family, but again, I like to think that because of the work we did that day, we were able to, save some evidence potentially that was able to be used at trial later on. So I think it's a fair sentence based on the crime.
I think in this case there is closure. We found out what happened. Again, based on the evidence, we found out what happened. I think the evidence told the whole story, whether or not Ezra wanted to tell the truth about what happened. And if I was a family member and Alex was someone that I cared about closely, I would feel some closure after this case. Yes, she would be in prison for a very long time or potentially the rest of her life and wouldn't be capable of doing something like this to somebody else ever again.
A life taken, a community grieving and in shock. But there is some small sense of peace and knowing that McCandless's jealousy won't claim another life.